Welcome. I'm New Leaf Meditation Project founder Anthony Cernera, and I am here with my good friend Leann Harris, who is also one of our instructors, who will introduce our special guest for tonight. Leann?
Hi, thanks everyone for joining. I know it's the end of our 10-day self-compassion challenge. If you're watching this on YouTube later, we just finished, I should say this is day 9, and we're just about to wrap up tomorrow of a challenge that we use to work on self-compassion and how do we develop it in our daily lives. So of course, in my mind, who would I go to find out more about self-compassion and compassionate work than my good friend, soon to be Dr. Russell Kolts. I wanted to introduce him tonight and let you guys know that he is the man behind most of the writings in the challenge. He wrote the book, literally, Compassion Focused Therapy Made Simple. And although in the subtitle it says A Clinician's Guide, just ignore that part. I really think it is the most comprehensive and simple and easy to understand book on compassion. And I think anytime in there when we talk about speaking to the client, when I read it, I say speaking to me. And that's how I kind of turn it into self-compassion when reading a book like this. So thank you, Russell. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. Oh, you're very welcome. I have to say, this has been an unexpected surprise for me. I really wrote the book with therapists in mind, thinking, we need a really practical guide for therapists to use to do CFT with their clients. And I've had a number of people respond by saying what you just said, which is people who aren't therapists saying, this isn't just a book for therapists. Reading it, I got something just from reading it, and I'm not a therapist. And that's just such a joy to hear that it's translating in ways that I hadn't even anticipated. So thank you for saying that. It feels really good to hear.
Good. I just want to read and introduce you a little bit more formally. Dr. Russell Kolts is a clinical psychologist and professor at Eastern Washington University outside Spokane, Washington, and is a founder of the Inland Northwest Compassionate Mind Center. Dr. Kolts regularly conducts trainings and workshops on compassion-focused therapy, as well as on mindfulness and compassion practices. His professional interests lie primarily in the application of CFT and mindfulness approaches to individuals suffering from problematic anger, trauma, mood, and attachment-related difficulties. Kolts has published and presented research in diverse areas such as positive psychology, PTSD, psychopharmacology, mindfulness, and compassion. In his personal life, Dr. Kolts enjoys family time, reading, meditation, outdoor activities, listening to and playing music. So there's your very formal one. You can find more about him out on the web. There are a number of you Google Dr. Russell Kolts, Kolts. He has compassionatemind.net. His Amazon.com page shows all of his books. Besides CFT Made Simple, he's also an author on Buddhist psychology and cognitive behavior therapy. I've shown that book before to the group, and a lot of people said they were interested. An Open-Hearted Life. Let's see, Managing Your Anger, Living with an Open Heart, and the Compassionate Mind Approach to Managing Your Anger. So I honestly have all the books. I have a couple more of them here and on the Kindle. Really, really helpful. So thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So Russell, maybe we could start at the beginning, if you don't mind. What got you interested in compassion-focused therapy?
Well, I kind of found my way there in kind of a roundabout way. I did actually, if anyone's seen the TEDx talk I did, I talk about this a little bit. But I'm someone who has always sort of had kind of an irritable temperament. It would be nice. I wish I was one of those really like naturally kind of born calm, easygoing sort of people. But that really wasn't in the cards for me, it seemed. And so really growing up and into adulthood, I struggled with irritability and sometimes anger. And about 11 years ago, my son Dylan came along, and I became aware in the first 6 months of his life that I was modeling things for him that I didn't want to be modeling for him, that I didn't want him to struggle with in terms of irritability and anger and things like that. And I talk about that in the TEDx talk a little bit. But to make a kind of a long story short, I decided I needed to do something about this if I was going to be the sort of father I wanted to be. And so I started reading a number of books and I discovered this book called Awakening the Buddha Within. Actually, that was the second book I read. The first one was called The Wisdom of Forgiveness, that I actually had recommended to a student of mine who was struggling with kind of a difficult situation. She had had kind of an emotionally abusive relationship with her mother. Her mother was in many ways not so healthy, and so had been sort of emotionally abusive to my student for several years growing up, actually most of her life. And her mother, she came to talk to me one day, and her mother was dying of cancer. And so she wanted to be there for her mom, but she also felt a lot of anger and rage and hostility toward her as well. And, so I said one of those very psychologist-y things to say, it sounds like you need to work on forgiveness, right? Which is easy to say, but rather hard to do. So that evening I went online and I started looking for a book on forgiveness for her. And I knew she had at least a passing interest in Buddhism. And I just kind of stumbled across this book called The Wisdom of Forgiveness. And it said it was by the Dalai Lama. And I thought, oh, that'd be great. It'd speak to her interest in Buddhism and it's on forgiveness. So I ordered her one. And I think the site I was on had like a buy one, get one deal or something going on. So I ordered one for myself, just, for the heck of it. And to make a long story short, the books came in, I gave one to her and, chatted with her a few times about this. And she ended up taking a semester off school and really kind of shepherded her mom along through the process of dying. And it was just I think a really beautiful situation in terms of how that worked out. Sad, but very poignant in terms of how she was able to be there for her mother. But for my part, I kind of read that book and I saw this kind of vision as I was struggling with the things that I didn't like about the sort of father I was. This book in describing his holiness really gave me a vision of the sort of father I wanted to have, my son to have. And not a leader of a religion, but, the kindness and the compassion and the steadfastness and all those things that, at least in that point in my life, I felt like I was lacking. And so I really dove into Buddhism for about 3 years. And basically, I'm a scientist by trade, not a terribly good one, but that's, I'm a university professor. And, so I kind of diving into this religious tradition, I kind of took my critical thinking and set it over here for a little bit and said, I don't know about, I'm not looking for religion really, but what I know is that these methods produce this type of person. And that's the kind of person I want to become. So I'm going to do this. So I dove into it for about 3 years and spent quite a lot of time, about an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening meditating and doing Buddhist practice, things like this. And after about 3 years, I kind of emerged on the other side. My critical thinking kind of woke up. My Lama had been kind of pushing me to do some practices that were preparing for death and navigating that whole thing in a way that I didn't really believe. And so it kind of triggered me to kind of look back and reassess things. And I became aware of a couple things. I became aware first and foremost that I was a different person than I was when I had started. I mean, I was still me, but I was much less irritable. I struggled much less with anger. And although, I think we're always a work in progress, I looked a lot more like the sort of father that I wanted my son to have and the sort of person I wanted to be, which as I reflected upon that, it became clear to me that it was the compassion practices that had really transformed me, that was the stuff from the Buddhist practice that really had powerfully impacted my life, which led me to kind of, not an ethical crisis, but kind of a conundrum as a psychologist, because I had this moment where it's like, I don't know if I can keep functioning as a psychologist, seeing clients and doing clinical training without bringing some of this compassion stuff that was so powerfully transformative to me into my work as a psychologist and a therapist and a clinical trainer and things like this. And as I said, I'm enough of a scientist to be kind of uncomfortable with just reaching into a religion and plucking out practices and then plopping them down over here in the therapy room without any sort of scientific rationale for doing so. I mean, that to me in some ways feels disrespectful both to the religion and to the science. So it occurred to me that I couldn't be the only one who'd had this revelation. So I started reading more and started looking. And I actually came across a wonderful book by Jack Kornfield, who is both a clinical psychologist and a former Buddhist monk. So he really is one of the best examples of someone who has kind of a foot in both camps. And this book was called The Wise Heart, and I recommend it highly. It was a wonderful book. But in that book, I found a reference to Paul Gilbert. And I initially contacted Paul because I had done a lit search in compassion. And at that point, this is maybe 7, 8 years ago, maybe 9, there really wasn't much in the literature on compassion. If you did like a PsycInfo search on compassion and psychology, you found almost nothing. You did find Kristen Neff's self-compassion scale and some studies related to self-compassion. But, that was about it. And for me, I've never really been interested in self-compassion as its own thing. For me, it really, the Buddhist kind of bodhisattva practices around cultivating compassion for all beings are what really clicked for me. And of course, the idea is you're part of all beings. That's where the self-compassion is for me. It's like I should direct the same compassion to me that I want to direct to everybody else because I'm part of that too. But I didn't find any literature on it really. And so I thought, well, I know how to stimulate literature in psychology. You need a measure. When people can measure stuff, then they can research it. So I started working on this measure of compassion and came up with an item pool and consulted with some Buddhist nuns and some other people on it. But I'm kind of a lazy guy and I'm not a psychometrist. So I about halfway through that process started looking to see, did anyone else have a measure so that I could sort of not have to do it? And that's when I kind of, about that time is when I came across Paul Gilbert's name. And so I just kind of shot him an email out of the dark and said, do you have a measure of compassion? It looks like you might. And he sent me a very kind email back where he said, I don't have a measure. There's one out there that I'm not so happy with, but, I don't have a measure. But what I do have is this compassion-focused therapy model. And I'm doing a training in December, and it's full, but I'd be glad to create space for you. And if you want to come over to the training, I'll even put you up at my house. So I was very excited about this, but it was during my finals week, and I thought, oh gosh, I can't do this. So I was getting ready to email Paul and say, oh my gosh, what an amazing offer, but the timing doesn't work for me, maybe another time. And I went home, and I decided to talk to my wife about it before I did decline. And she looked at me, and she said, Russell, you have to do this. This is it. This is the thing you want to do. This is the thing your life's been about for several years, building toward. You got to do this. So I did. And I went out and went to my first training, and it was just, I've kind of, as I've gotten older, I've come to recognize when a chunk of your life kind of clicks into place. I don't know if you've ever had those moments where you're like, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. And I had that moment with CFT at that first training. It's like it clicked in, and it was like, this is it. This is what my life's going to be about. And 8 years later, I can say this is, professionally speaking, it is kind of what my life is about. So that's kind of the short version of a long story, which probably longer than you needed.
Wonderful.
No, that's awesome. Thanks.
Yeah.
Going back to your student, we actually had a very similar, I asked for questions in our New Leaf Meditation Project discussion group, and someone asked a very similar question, and I bet almost everyone reading this challenge has asked themselves the same thing. She asked, how often do you encounter people who cannot at all retrain their brains for self-compassion due to someone with coming from a very tough or abusive household? Have you run across people who totally cannot make any headway whatsoever?
I have come across people who believe that they cannot do self-compassion.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of people who are very reluctant to engage in self-compassion. And I think that there are a number of reasons for that. I think one is misconception about what it means. I think a lot of people think self-compassion means letting yourself off the hook, or, you know, just like it's weak or indulgent or things like that, which of course isn't true. I mean, compassion and self-compassion really are all about what we do in the face of suffering, right? Do we meet it with avoidance? Do we meet it with condemnation? Or do we meet it with warmth and courage and the willingness to really engage with it well enough to understand it so that we can maybe work with it and do something about it, you know? But I think unfortunately in the culture, there is this kind of idea that compassion is somehow like pink and fluffy and, you know, that sort of thing. So I think that's sort of one aspect of that. But I think the other is that people get these ideas about themselves from these environments and contexts that they grow up in. And they can become very wed to their self-critics. They can be, you know, some people, there are a lot of people, a lot of professionals, for example, who generally, I think, function pretty well, but struggle with relating kindly to themselves. They're utterly convinced that the only way they can motivate themselves is through self-criticism. Right? If I attack myself enough, that'll keep me going. And they can be very reluctant to giving up the self-criticism because they feel like if I do that, then I won't do anything. Right? I won't work out. I won't work hard at work. I won't do the things I need to do. And if you think about that, that's based on a pretty fundamental misconception, which is the idea that criticizing yourself is the only way, or perhaps the best way, that you can motivate yourself. And I would argue that actually compassion is a pretty good way to motivate yourself, right? If you can connect with this idea that what would be good for me, and you know, motivate yourself from that perspective, I think that's another way of doing that. But getting more to your point, Leann, there are other people, because they come out of environments that maybe were abusive or had very critical caregivers or something like this, they may actually be very convinced that they're bad, right? Or maybe related to things they've done. In some of the prison work that I allude to in my anger book, there are a lot of the guys in the prison groups who they just, you know, when you meet them, they would, the guys in the group would say, oh, didn't you know, we're the scum of the earth. Right? And they would have internalized this. And so people have this idea that I deserve to be punished. I deserve, you know, I'm not good. And so I have run across a lot of people who are convinced that they're not worthy of self-compassion. And if you'd like, I'd love to talk a little bit about how I work with that, because I think it's kind of an important question.
Definitely.
So I think that the challenge that the therapist, or that, you know, the person, if you're working with it individually, that you have to meet is, how do you shift from seeing this I'm bad, seeing the shame as like reality with a capital R, as the way it is? How do you shift from that to something I learned from my experience, right, that may or may not be true? Because once you soften it like that, then you can work with it and you can play with it. But there's almost nothing you can say. You can argue with people till you're blue in the face. But if they're convinced this is the way it is, I'm bad, their experience in the face of all your arguments are going to be, you don't understand. I get you, everything you're saying is wonderful, but you don't understand that I'm bad. Right? The level of conviction they have around that is really profound in some cases. So in compassion-focused therapy, one of the things we do when we're working about with this clients, and you can do it with yourself too, is, you know, I will say, I don't believe that there's like one true version of the self. Like there is a wholly existing, there's a true Russell, that if I just look for Russell, I'll find him, and that's me. And I think a lot of people have this idea. But actually, if you look, and we talk about this CFT all the time. So if you look at any of my books or any of Paul Gilbert's books or the other books in compassion-focused therapy, you're going to see this, what we call a spider diagram. And the spider diagram will have like a motivation or an emotion like anger in the middle of it, or compassion in the middle of it. And then there are little arrows or little spires that go out, which are linked to attention, thinking and reasoning, mental imagery, motivation, behavior, those sorts of things, felt emotion. And so the idea behind that is that actually each of us contains almost infinite versions of us. Have you ever had, like, reflected on a situation in which you were really depressed, really angry, and actually you had done or behaved in a way that you almost can't believe that you did, that felt so much unlike you that you couldn't believe you had even done that? Well, the reason for that is whatever you put in that middle circle organizes all those other processes. So for example, if I'm feeling jealous of somebody, I pay attention to them and I think about them and I imagine them and I'm motivated to behave and I feel toward them in a completely different way than if I feel in a caregiving way about them, than if I have a competitive orientation toward them, right? If I'm angry, that organizes all that stuff in an entirely different way than if I'm compassionate. Does this make sense?
Yep.
And so when someone tells me, I use this versions of the self language a lot. So when someone tells me, I'm bad, I don't deserve compassion, I'm fatally flawed, or whatever their position is, rather than trying to argue with them about something that deep down they have great conviction about, right? They know to be true. I might say something like, so it sounds like to me there's a version of you that is completely convinced that you're not worthy of compassion. That there's this version of you that just knows beyond a shadow of a doubt that you're bad. And I bet that anything I would say to that version of you would bounce off. It would have no effect at all on that belief. Is that right? Right? And then I might say something like, I'm interested, when did that version of you like learn that you're so bad? How did that version of you figure out that you are not worthy of compassion? How did you learn that? And very often, most of the time, people can talk about that. They can talk about when I first knew. That's another question. When did you first know this about yourself? You're unlovable, or whatever this horrible thing is they believe. And oftentimes they can tell you. And while that may not seem like much, what we've just done is taken this idea that I'm essentially unlovable or I'm bad, and we've created a shift from this is the way it is to this is something I learned. Right? Now, the other thing I might say at that point is I might say, I'm wondering if there's perhaps another version of you, maybe who's very small and very quiet and only dare speak in a whisper, who wonders if that might not be true, who wonders if, or hopes or wishes that you could be worthy of compassion, that someone could care about you, you know. And as a therapy client, I've got an ace in the hole, and the ace in the hole is that something brought them into my office, right? And I would say to people who are doing your program, there is that other version of them too that hopes or wants them to be worthy of compassion, because why else would they be doing the program, right? There's something in there that's hopeful of that. So if you can get some acknowledgement or awareness of that, okay. So we've got these two different versions of the self. One that's been going to the gym my whole life, that's convinced I'm bad, and there's no way that he's never going to change his mind, right? She's never going to change. But maybe there's this other version that hopes that maybe things could be different. So all we need to do now is send her to the gym. How do we grow this? We don't need to get rid of this one, right? We don't need to worry about that. We don't need to argue with that. We want to see, how do we build the compassion? And that's the trick. You don't have to believe that you're worthy of compassion to start trying to develop that capacity, right? And this is actually consistent with, I think, the data on how you work with beliefs. If you've heard, there's this thing they call the third wave of behavior therapy, which basically works with beliefs in a way that's different than cognitive behavior therapy used to. It used to be that when people would have ideas like nobody likes me. You know, you'd try to gather evidence in their life that disagreed with that and basically dispute it. So they kind of create this internal argument and try to gather evidence for the new helpful thought and kind of mentally shout down the other one. Well, what some research shows is that doing that actually tends to strengthen the belief that you want to get rid of. Maybe because you're treating it as something that's solid, right? And the kind of third wave therapies, the approach is very different. It's much more of a mindful approach where you just notice, look, I'm thinking that nobody cares about me. Oh, that's kind of a painful thought. What would be helpful in working with this feeling I've got as a result of that? So anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. So
no, this is absolutely wonderful. And Leann, do you have any closing thoughts before I wrap it up here?
No, I just wanted to say I'm really grateful for your son now, because if he's the one that caused you to want to be the father that you wanted to be, and it caused you to go down this road for you to end up giving us this teaching in this time, really, thank you very much. I think you have succinctly summed up all the books and all the teachings with why self-compassion and why compassion for everyone is compassion for the self, exactly like you said. I think this is a very, very, we're lucky to have your teaching. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah, really appreciate your time tonight. You helped me. I have to say, I loved your book, An Open-Hearted Life was given to me as a gift by a friend a few months ago. And it was just, didn't put together until looked at your bio page and went, oh my gosh, this is the guy we're talking about tonight. So this was really wonderful for me. I mean, your book has helped me in the past. This little talk will definitely help some of our friends. I hope for those of you in our community who are watching this on YouTube, I'm going to put some links in the comment section below. Absolutely, if you haven't seen it already, check out Russell's TED Talk. And really, I think all of his books are absolutely worth picking up. We'll include the Amazon link there. Russell, thank you so much for your time tonight. Have a great...
Thank you. Thank you. It's been wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.